and the Shah would only sign the contract if he could f*** the sales rep's wife. He agreed. Konnichiwa minasan, and welcome back to Shogun History. Today's review follows the miraculous story of governments, spies, and Hollywood working together to extract diplomatic fugitives from a country actively hunting down US citizens. Winning the Oscar for Best Picture in 2013, this film is an audience favourite. But how well does it stand up to historical scrutiny? We find out today as we explore one of the greatest espionage triumphs of the 20th century. This is
Argo, fuck yourself.
Ben Affleck's 2014 hit Argo tells the outlandish story of when the Canadian government and the CIA used a fake movie production as a cover to rescue American citizens during the 1979 Iran hostage crisis. The diplomatic standoff between Iran and the United States began, as most US conflicts seem to, with the desire for Western nations to protect their oil interests. To get some context on how the unrest which led to this situation came about, we need to head back to the 1950s to a very different Iran. A newly democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, was a beloved figure in Iran. During his tenure, he introduced a range of social and economic policies, the most significant being the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry. He argued that Iran should profit from their own oil reserves, which, for the previous decades, had been exclusively run by the privately owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You may know this company today as British Petroleum. As you might imagine, the nationalisation didn't go down well with the British.
I am not going to start here and let you
take my oil.
No way. I'm getting frustrated.
Who stood to lose a very lucrative resource. After months of failed negotiations with the British, Mossadegh broke off and denied British involvement in Iranian oil. Because of this, it was Britain who first appealed to the United States for help in orchestrating the toppling of the current Irani leadership and restoring full power back to the monarch, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran. Thus began the joint campaign of the CIA and the British Secret Intelligence Service's covert involvement in Iranian politics, a foreign policy which would gravely affect the region and shape the oppressive theocracy that still rules Iran to this day. Officially, the argument was to save Iran from communist influence and the Soviet threat. However, in reality, despite a small communist party, there was little Soviet interest in Iran. The real reason was if the nationalization of oil in Iran was successful, this would set a dangerous precedent that may lead other countries such as Kuwait, Venezuela, or Indonesia to follow with their own oil nationalization. Despite this, the British and the US intelligence used the communist threat as a bogey to persuade the public that the coup was justifiable. The CIA involvement had been considered common knowledge for many years, but wasn't officially confirmed until declassified documents were revealed to the public as part of the agency's 50th anniversary celebrations in 1997. The CIA division chief of the time, Kermit Roosevelt,
Hi, I'm Kermit.
the grandson of former US President Theodore Roosevelt, played a lead role in inciting the coup. Roosevelt quickly seized control of the Iranian press by buying them off with bribes and circulating anti-Mossadegh propaganda, running lies and unflattering caricatures of Mossadegh throughout the press, claiming he was a Jew, a homosexual, and a British agent. The CIA also paid Iranians to masquerade as communists that threatened religious leaders while executing bombings, all to spread the fire of civil unrest and contribute to the ousting of Mossadegh. Over the course of 4 days in August 1953, Roosevelt would orchestrate not one, but two attempts to destabilize the government of Iran. First, a dramatic attempt to apprehend Mossadegh at his house in the middle of the night. However, this failed, as Mossadegh learned of the attempt in time and was able to fight back. Much like many members of his family before him, Roosevelt's embodiment of American neo-imperialism was unperturbed, leading him to orchestrate a second coup, which this time succeeded. Mossadegh was placed on trial and the Shah commuted his sentence to be spent under house arrest. With the appointment of a puppet prime minister, the Shah now had a stranglehold on power and was much more accepting of foreign interest in Iranian oil, providing the price was right.
The price is wrong, bitch.
What followed was over 25 years of dictatorship, which led to a rise of religious and political extremism. Life in Iran under the Shah was characterized by significant modernization, westernization, and economic development. In 1963, the Shah announced the White Revolution, a 6-point program of reform calling for the nationalization of the forests, the sale of state-owned enterprises to private interests, electoral changes to enfranchise women and allow non-Muslims to hold office, and a literacy campaign in the nation's schools. Some of these pictures of the time show how progressive the country had become under the Shah's rule, compared to the modern religious regime that governs Iran today. However, the Shah's regime was also marked by authoritarian rule, political repression, and human rights abuses. There was growing discontent among various segments of the population. One of the biggest vocal critics to the Shah's White Revolution was religious cleric Ruhollah Khomeini, who viewed these political reforms as westernization and an attack on traditionalism and Islam itself. After inciting further dissidents, Khomeini was exiled to Turkey in 1964. After the coup, the Shah established a brutal secret police force named the Savak. The Savak's aim was to strengthen the Shah's regime by placing political opponents under surveillance and repressing dissident movements. The Savak had the power to censor the media, screen applicants for government jobs, and to hunt down the opposition by using all means necessary, including torture. Students who had studied abroad were also returning with new ideas about how the country should be run. This generation of young adults demanded more political freedom, and they found the monarchy absurd. From the early 70s, the political landscape started to become very heated. Many underground activist groups began to form, with even some resorting to armed resistance. This in turn scared the Shah and yielded more widespread crackdowns. Universities would often close because of the unrest, and thousands of people were harassed and arrested by the Savak. Due to the Shah's failure to modernize the political and cultural space, the country became unsustainably polarized and the government was on thin ice. In August 1978, the deaths of over 400 people in the Cinema Rex fire, claimed by the opposition as having been orchestrated by Pahlavi Savak, came to serve as a catalyst for a popular revolutionary movement across all of Iran, and large-scale strikes and demonstrations paralyzed the entire country for the remainder of that year. Finally, on the 16th of January 1979, Shah Pahlavi, now riddled with cancer, abdicated and fled the country to the United States, which had granted him political asylum. On the 1st of February 1979, Khomeini returned to Iran, officially bringing an end to the monarchist dictatorship and assuming leadership while the guerrillas and rebel troops overwhelmed the Shah's loyalists in armed combat. The new Iranian regime demanded the Shah's return. They wanted him to stand trial for the crimes he was accused of committing against Iranians during his rule through his secret police. Because of the US's meddling and their role in granting the Shah asylum, anti-US sentiment was rife and culminated on November 4th, 1979, when one of the demonstrations organized by Iranian student unions loyal to Khomeini erupted in an all-out conflict right outside the walled compound housing the US Embassy. This is where the movie opens and is remarkably similar to the scenes depicted in photos of the time. Eventually, the students breached the gates of the compound and into the embassy buildings. During the commotion, two groups of American diplomats who were working in a building separate from the main consular building were able to sneak out onto the street through a side exit. One group was unfortunately apprehended and escorted back to the compound. The others, after a week of switching between different countries' embassies, would eventually contact Canadian immigration officer John Sheardown, who, along with the Canadian ambassador Ken Taylor, invited them to his residence for refuge. Before I continue with the historical breakdown, I want to mention the opening of the film. We're given some context in artsy style storyboard animations. However, it is a little misleading.
The young Shah was known for opulence and excess. His wife was rumored to bathe in milk, while the Shah had his lunches flown in by Concorde from Paris.
Firstly, there is no evidence that the Queen bathed in milk. I have no idea why you'd want to anyway. Additionally, the mention of lunches flown in from Paris is a reference to the 2500th anniversary of Iran, where the Shah threw one of the most expensive parties ever, flying in 18 tons of food to celebrate his country's and his own glory. This was a ridiculously lavish expense, but was certainly not a regular occurrence. I find it quite baffling that after 33 years of the Islamic Republic, with its dreadful record on human rights, abuses and excesses, the director found it necessary to open Argo with a distorted and one-dimensional picture of life in Iran before the revolution. I wanted to share another anecdote of the Shah's antics at the time. In 1959, a British company won a contract with the Iranian government that was suddenly cancelled and given to the German engineering company Siemens instead. After an investigation by the British Embassy, it was uncovered that the Shah wanted to bed the wife of the Siemens sales representative, and the agent consented in exchange for winning the contract that he'd just lost. With incidents such as this, brutal oppression of the opposition, and pandering to the United States, you can see why, in a mostly religious population, the Shah was not popular to say the least. I just wanted to convey it was much deeper and more complicated than what we were told here. The film has the escapees settling down to enforce cohabitation at the residence of the Canadian ambassador, Ken Taylor. The reality was a little more complicated. After several nights, including one spent in the UK residential compound, which the film discredits for some reason.
6 of them went out a back exit. Brits turned them away, Kiwis turned them away, Canadians took them in.
The group was split between the Taylor house and the home of the Canadian immigration officer, John Sheardown. I completely understand this small change. The group dynamic builds the tension and makes it seem more dramatic when there's disagreement. The story of the Iranian housemaid who uncovers the identity of the house guests and later lies for their protection is pure fabrication. Mark Lejek, one of the escaped 6, has since said that it's possible some of the employees may have worked out who they are, but unlike how the film demonstrates, most of the employees were from Europe or other parts of East Asia, and the concern of the staff was only a slight theoretical risk. What I do want to emphasize, which I don't believe the movie does enough, is the strong involvement of the Canadians. The film hinges on the trope that Americans are the heroes. The Canadians had taken great personal risks, giving refuge in their private homes to the 6 American diplomats who were in danger. The government back in Canada signed off on providing the escapees with fake passports and was an integral part of the operation's success. Former US President Jimmy Carter is even quoted as saying about the film, 90% of the contributions to the ideas and the consummation of the plan was Canadian. The film unfortunately gives almost full credit to the American CIA. The main hero, in my opinion, was Ken Taylor, who was the Canadian ambassador and orchestrated the entire process.
Or CIA are the good guys.
The Canadians are the good guys.
Yeah, we're not greedy, them too.
Only. Canada takes the credit of the retaliate against the hostages. Great Satan wasn't involved. No CIA.
Is that right, Jack?
Involved in what?
The Canadian caper, as it's come to be known, was the brainchild of exfiltration and forgery expert Tony Mendez, played by Ben Affleck and whose memoir the film is based upon, and his colleague, skilled linguist Ed Johnson, who despite not appearing in the movie, actually accompanied Mendez to Iran and was present throughout the whole operation. I believe the decision not to include Ed Johnson was actually done at his own request. It wasn't until 2023 that the CIA announced his involvement in an episode of the podcast, The Langley Files. The fake movie cover was thought up by Mendez, who, having worked with many consultants in the entertainment industry in the past, including award-winning makeup artist John Chambers, portrayed by John Goodman in the film, Chambers began advising on the fake movie story and aided in setting up the phony production company, Studio 6 Productions, a nod to the 6 diplomats. In the movie, Tony Mendez can be seen coming up with the Hollywood ruse as he watches Planet of the Apes on TV. While this isn't exactly what happened, it's a noteworthy detail considering that movie had earned John Chambers an Oscar. The other Hollywood insider helping Tony in the film is a producer played by the great Alan Arkin, and he is the only one who is essentially fictional, which is a bit ironic since the character is himself presented as the embodiment of Hollywood bullshit.
Well,
In reality, Chambers brought in fellow makeup man Robert Siddell, who worked on E.T. among many other movies. Together, they chose a script from a pile of manuscripts that had been previously submitted to Chambers for his consideration. The name Argo actually partly came from a vulgar knock-knock joke told by Chambers that had the phrase,
"Argo, fuck yourself,"
as the punchline. The CIA team behind the mission would often repeat the line as a way to break the tension while working long hours. We see it used very similarly throughout the film. The title Argo also came from Greek mythology. Specifically, it's the name of Jason and the Argonauts' ship that they sailed to the sacred garden to rescue the Golden Fleece from the clutches of the many-headed dragon. In Tony Mendez's memoir, he states, this precisely described the situation in Iran.
Like Jason and the Golden Fleece, or what?
No, it's the ship. It's the spaceship. It goes everywhere. It goes all throughout space.
There's one more line I wanted to mention that might go unnoticed without prior context. It's while John Chambers, Tony Mendez, and Lester Siegel are trying to figure out how to make their fake movie project look plausible. Siegel recalls that he made a movie with Rock Hudson and states,
"Get the press to sell it for you."
Is a reference to the fact that Rock Hudson, one of the biggest Hollywood stars and sex symbols of the 1950s, was secretly gay. His agent, Harry Wilson, actively fed misinformation about Hudson's girlfriends, really studio-arranged dates, to the mainstream media. Hudson's homosexuality was not widely known outside of Hollywood until his death in 1985. I think lines like this are great. A lesser movie would have felt the need to explain exactly what he meant, but Ben Affleck chose to leave this line in without context. It's subtle nods like this that you might not get on first watch, which, in my opinion, is the sign of elite filmmaking. Now there is another example of this in the movie. I didn't know this before my research and was confused on first watch, but by the late 1970s, the Hollywood sign, originally Hollywoodland, had actually fallen into severe disrepair as we're shown. In 1978, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce had a fundraising campaign in which 9 prominent people paid around $28,000 each to restore one letter. Some of these benefactors included Playboy magazine founder Hugh Hefner and rock star Alice Cooper. However, this restoration was actually completed before the events in the film even started, but I don't think that's important. It's another element that is not explained to the viewer. If, like me, you didn't know this fact, despite it only appearing on the screen for a second, it provides some curiosity, and for me is another example of how Ben Affleck generally cares about the era he's reincarnating. It would be the same film without this scene included, but I just love these small nods to real history. Well, if you haven't guessed it already, I love this film. It's exciting and engaging, with lots of subtle nods to the Hollywood zeitgeist and moments of comedy. It is also very accurate to real history. Obviously, this is a Hollywood movie, and we have to accept that to make a film that will engage the average viewer, they have to turn the tension up to 11. From here, I'm going to cover what's been dramatized. For the most part, with the exception of added scenes of tension, the core plot is very close to what really happened. The main scene that never occurred is when Tony and the others are forced on a location scout at the Grand Bazaar in Tehran. Unlike in the film, the government really didn't pay much attention to the supposed Canadian filmmakers. In fact, in Tony Mendez's memoir, he goes as far as to insinuate that a lot of the actual ruse wasn't really about fooling the Iranian government, but more to convince the 6 Americans that they could pull this off. It was there to ensure that they were going to go through the airport with confidence and without looking suspicious. Tony, an extraction expert, knew he had to come up with an idea that would make them feel comfortable, that would make them get engaged in this scenario. And he realized that Hollywood was a perfect choice, because everyone could kind of imagine what a Hollywood insider was like. Granted, they also had the alibi of the production office in LA and the press exposure to secure their alibi, but this was only a failsafe should the Revolutionary Guard decide to investigate further. In real life, the mission had never been called off at the last minute, forcing Tony Mendez to make a passionate call to his boss. In reality, the mission had always been a go ever since American President Jimmy Carter gave his approval prior to Tony taking his flight to Tehran. However, the real Tony Mendez did wake up 45 minutes late the morning of the extraction. He had slept through his watch alarm and was woken up when his ride to the airport had arrived and called his hotel room. Most of the mission from this point onwards went on without much much of a hitch. This includes a suspenseful scene that requires Ben Affleck's character to ask the woman at the airport ticket counter to recheck for the tickets. The reservation has always been in place, and there weren't any problem at the counter or any of the checkpoints. The ease of their real-life escape is partially attributed to the fact that they had booked an early morning 7:30 a.m. flight when the airport would be much less crowded. The officers would be sleepy, and the Revolutionary Guard would be mostly still in bed. The only setback occurred when the plane was delayed for an hour due to a minor mechanical problem. They were certainly not chased down the runway by officers and Revolutionary Guard at the airport. This scene is quite absurd. The takeoff speed of this aircraft is between 160 and 180 knots, and somehow the vehicles also drive directly behind the number 4 engine without being affected by the jet blast. I mean, what even was the plan here? Get run over by the wheels? But it wouldn't be Hollywood without a final escape by the skin of their teeth. The rescued 6 did, however, breathe a collective sigh of relief once they had cleared Iranian airspace, and to celebrate their escape, they toasted with Bloody Marys. Tony Mendez and the 6 Americans were also not detained at the airport. They were not sequestered like in the movie, and therefore there was no nearly missed, nail-biting phone call to Studio 6 Productions. But I do understand it wouldn't be a very exciting film with them strolling through check-in problem-free now, would it? The storyboards were also real, but Tony never gave them to the officers at the airport. Various pieces of concept art for the film still exist today and have appeared on display in spy-related exhibits across the US. The final thing I want to point out is right at the end of the film. The Iranian official seen on archive footage here, issuing dire threats against Canada for their role in the rescue, was actually later executed by the regime he served. I think the lesson here is to pick who you support very carefully. What's incredible about this film is that the most outlandish elements for the plot are true. In the end, the production of Argo becomes an extreme but comparative illusion of how the CIA, in operations of this kind, must fabricate identities and essentially produce an elaborate scene to act upon such impossible missions. The tension of the presented situation is so unbearably high that it required an equal measure of invention and imagination to resolve, and in turn the same measure required by Affleck to make Argo such a great picture. This is such a fascinating, crowd-pleasing film on multiple levels, shown by how highly this is rated by audience and critics alike. One of the fascinating aspects of the real-world espionage is that it's really all about the details, and there can be a lot of drama in a guy checking a cachet or an ink forgery, the quality of a paper or a document, but that's just not going to translate very well on the big screen. So you've got to look for ways to engage the audience, which is why I can accept these dramatic alterations to the real story. Everything from the politics to the actual people involved in the story, and above all, the quality of filmmaking on display, demonstrates the skills of an adept and thoughtful director. Once more, Affleck has not only reminded us that his best performances come when he's in control, but that he's also a considerable force behind the camera.
You teach somebody to be a director in a day?
You teach a rhesus monkey to be a director in a day.
Hi minasan. The Shogun has been delighted with this film. Today's score for historical accuracy, a solid 8.5 out of 10. For entertainment value, 9.2 out of 10. Bringing the total score to 88.5%, which puts Argo on its well-deserved place at the top of the Shogun rankings. Thank you again so much for coming back for my second episode. I have so much fun making these videos, and all the comments and support I receive mean the absolute world to me. If you enjoyed today, please help the Shogun expand his empire by liking and subscribing. And of course, if you have a historical movie you want to know the real history behind, please leave it in the comments below. じゃあ皆さん、次回も楽しみにしてね。気をつけてね。さようなら。